My name's Karamir Muffet, and I'm going to take you through the first part of this presentation, and then I'm going to hand over to Nick Mantle, who will then take over and take you through the rest of the presentation. So the 25 to 26 national funding formula that we know as the NFF won't be published by the usual timescale of July this year, and the new timelines will be confirmed following decisions on the overall core schools budget settlement for 25-26. But our working assumption is going to be that alongside the NFF allocations themselves, the usual suite of products will be published, which includes the Schools Operational Guide, the High Needs Guide, and the NFF policy document. So in advance of the publication of the NFF allocations and supporting products, we're trying to encourage LAs to consider whether they'll be submitting a disapplication and to begin engaging with the schools forums as early as possible, because this will help LAs and schools manage the impact of the delays to the usual NFF timings. So at this date, local authorities should assume that current policy on disapplications are going to remain the same as it was for last year, and those assumptions will all be covered in the slides which we've got to come. So when you're setting school budgets, local authorities can submit a disapplication request to us. We are the Education and Skills Funding Agency. We're also known as ESFA, where its local approach to school funding would not ordinarily be allowable within the schools and early years finance regulations and the DSG, the Dedicated Schools Grant. It is important to note regulations being disapplied for 25-26 will be the 25 regulations. These will likely be laid in the new year, as is usually the case. So if you wouldn't mind continuing to use the current regulations, but once we receive the disapplication request and the updated regulations, we'll ensure that it has the correct regulation assigned over to it. So the regulations and the DSG conditions of grant, they detail how the local authorities can distribute the DSG funding, such as the allowable funding formula factors and those pass-through rates, and the ring fencing between blocks. The regulations also cover what local authorities can retain for central expenditure. So for an example, statutory responsibilities that local authorities hold for all schools or maintained schools only, such as admissions and audits. The department also receives requests from local authorities to set aside some aspects of the regulations or conditions of grant where they have identified that there's an unintended consequence due to a local situation. But the key message here, of course, is that disapplication requests should be used for exceptional reasons only, and there must always be a regulation or a condition to disapply. So safety valve local authorities and those engaged in discussions with the department during that funding year 24-25 should make any linked disapplication requests as part of those discussions. The dates we mentioned in this presentation doesn't apply to safety valve local authorities. You can also contact the safety valve team to discuss your disapplication request further at their email address that you can see on screen. And of course, you'll get these slides, so you'll have it on them too. But just for clarity, it is safetyvalve.program@education.gov.uk. So this slide will cover block movements, high needs, general and early years disapplication requests. So all of the disapplication requests. But it really is important to note that this is based on what we have done in previous years. Of course, currently we haven't got confirmation if this is going to stay the same this year. So previously, the supporting information we looked for when we received a request were the impact your request would have on your schools, your pupils, and the local authority itself, along with any alternative options that have been considered. What alternatives had been explored and why these alternatives were not being taken forward. We asked for a financial model such as local authorities' DSG position and an up-to-date financial position of the affected schools, including the levels of reserves. And we also looked at any transitional steps that might have been taken or mitigations that may have been considered and agreed. And also, if your request resulted in a reduction in funding, if it did, then we would need to see an explanation of what steps you had taken to ensure that there would not be any detriment to pupils' outcomes and education provision. We also looked at details of the wider context of the request, such as how you had considered local factors prior to submitting the request. And we also looked at details around how the request aligned with local authority and DfE future strategic approach to education provision, for example, Ofsted improvement and DSG recovery plans. We would also have needed to see consultation outcomes, specifically what were the views of the impacted schools, parents and carers groups, schools forum or any other interested parties. And we also needed to see a copy of the schools forum minutes, and they should have been detailing the votes for the disapplication request, so we could actually see when the meeting happened, what the forum voted on and what the outcome of that vote was. And finally, you were also asked to include summaries of any other consultations. So the considerations then that we make when we considered why this request is the local authority's preferred option, why the local authority considers this to result in the best possible outcomes for schools, pupils and local authority in the short term and also in the longer term as well. So moving on to the overview then of the process. Previously, when we received your request, we would review the supporting evidence to ensure what we needed was there. We needed to understand the reasons behind your request to ensure we're making fair and reasonable and consistent decisions. And as such, at times, we had to come back to you with an ask for additional information or to ask any questions that we might have, either on the supporting information that had been submitted or the request itself. Your request was then put up to the Secretary of State to make a decision. Once we got the response back from the Secretary of State, that's when we then communicate that decision to you, the local authorities, including any conditions which have been attached to that specific decision. So I'm going to move you on to block transfer requests now. All block transfer disapplications are considered on a case-by-case basis, and each request will apply for 1 year only. So again, our working assumption is that schools block is to be partially ring-fenced in 25-26, and it's been as it has been in previous years, but it's not yet confirmed government policy. If this is the case, this will mean that you can assume the transfer of up to 0.5% of your schools block funding into another block with the approval of your schools forum. In all other cases of wanting to move funds, you would need to submit a block movement disapplication request. So this includes if you wanted to move less than 0.5% without your schools forum approval or above 0.5% with your schools forum approval. So this year it's really important for all LAs that are wishing to make a block transfer to get in touch with us to have a discussion, even if this transfer is below 0.5%. If you think there's a possibility that your schools forum might not agree this transfer, it's really important you get in touch with us and have a discussion. If your LA has judged a block transfer to be necessary in recent years, it would also be prudent to plan on that basis for 25-26, given that the disapplication could be withdrawn if the LA judges it no longer necessary once we know the funding allocations for 25-26. So the first thing that we look at then is the supporting information sent to us alongside the disapplication request. Most requests currently are to move money out of the schools block over to the high needs block. Updated guidance will be published on the .gov.uk website in due course, and this will set out just what is required alongside the request. However, for block movements, there are some additional specific requirements that we have. You'll need to provide a financial management plan which shows forecasts and the impact of this block transfer that you're proposing. We have a management plan template that I'm sure you've all seen and hopefully was in the last presentation with the management plan. If you're not, you can catch up on that on YouTube. But we would encourage you to use this template, and if it's fully completed, it will show the majority of the financial information that we need for the block movement request. We also need to see, in addition to the management plan, information around any previous block movements, including those that didn't require a disapplication request, a DSG management plan that includes a forecast position for the next 5 years, details of predicted EHCP growth, sufficiency, and the actions of the local authority, is taking to mitigate overspending, and costed mitigating actions with narrative explaining how the figures have been derived. A rationale for this transfer, including changes in demand over the last 3 years, and how the local authority has met that demand by commissioning places in all sectors. Plans to change the pattern of provision where necessary, evidence of partnership working between the local authority, schools and parents and carers, and an explanation of plans to support the inclusion of children with SEND in mainstream schools, information presented to all schools through consultation and to the schools forum, and details of responses to the transfer proposal, including papers and minutes of the schools forum meetings showing details of the vote. So we also require an equality assessment, but as this is needed for every disapplication, not just block movements, Nick's going to address this a little later in the presentation. When we've received all this supporting information, we then put this to the Minister, and this will include information around why the high needs costs are exceeding funding levels, and we also have to provide a detail of short, medium and longer term strategies, including financial data that the local authority has planned. It's really important to highlight that we also require evidence that Schools Forum has voted for or against the request to transfer money. We advise all local authorities to arrange their Schools Forum meetings to discuss the block transfer requests ahead of submission deadlines, which will be published in that updated guidance in due course. But without this information, we're unable to put your disapplication request up to the Minister, and this will then cause delays in relaying decisions back to you, and ultimately that will also result in you submitting your APT without the full knowledge of its transfer and if it has been approved or not. I keep saying this, but it's also really important for us to understand how the block transfer will be spent to improve outcomes for children and young people, or as an invest to save plan to improve financial sustainability. So I'd ask you to think carefully about your narrative and make sure you tell us your story. Often when we get disapplication requests, the full context of your request isn't clear, but things that we absolutely need to know: why this proposed transfer is your preferred option, how it fits with your longer term plans to manage your DSG, what the impact of the transfer will be on children and young people, how involved schools, parents and carers have been in producing your plan. And also, does Schools Forum agree with your plans for SEND improvement or DSG management, even if they don't agree with the block transfer? Okay, so we're going to move on to high needs now. So I'm going to hand you over to Nick.
Thanks, Karamia. Yeah, so moving on to the high needs disapplications now. So again, like with block movements and all disapplications, it's really important you discuss these well in advance of a formal submission, as these are exceptional, and it is important that the information submitted is relevant and sufficient for an informed decision to be taken. For the current 24-25 year, we have 3 types. Now, as Karamia has mentioned a few slides a moment ago, I'll reiterate that we should say up front, new government ministers have not yet decided on whether there should be any changes to the current rules. You can read the supporting detail for items 1 and 2 on the slide in respect to the current financial year, and that will be found in Annex 1 and Annex 2 respectively of the current 24-25 High Needs Operational Guide. Turning to the Special Schools Minimum Funding Guarantee, no details on the rate or calculation methodology are currently available for the 25-26 year. We would always expect a local authority to consider and respond appropriately to schools' cost increases in securing the provision required for the pupils. They should take account of any costs the schools have to meet, for example, energy costs or staff pay awards, as well as a contribution from other funding streams that schools receive, such as Teachers Pay Additional Grant or Teachers Pension Employer Contribution Grant. Now, where a local authority wishes to adjust the top-up funding across several schools following a review of its top-up funding rates and as a result of some schools gaining funding and others facing a reduction, a disapplication may be required depending on the minimum funding guarantee rate, although the request may only be relevant to those schools whose funding would fall below the guaranteed level. So consequently, and assuming a similar minimum funding guarantee methodology in 25-26, local authorities would not, through this process, need to seek endorsement of the entirety of a new top-up funding scheme that they are intending to implement across some or all of their special schools. In any case, we would expect any planned reductions in special schools top-up funding to have been prepared well in advance with the necessary consultation to have taken place locally, especially with the schools affected and taking account of the impact on individual schools' finances. Then there are disapplications for when a student aged 19 or over stays in a school despite having completed a course of secondary education that began before they were 18. For this, a disapplication of the relevant regulation is required. Now, given these requests are exceptional, we want to underscore the importance of local authorities planning ahead in collaboration with schools and post-19 settings, as otherwise such scenarios can cause a huge amount of anxiety for the young person and their family or carers. Finally, I would say that for all these circumstances in which a disapplication may be required, even though we're not in a position to confirm the rules at this present time, the important thing is to plan ahead, consult schools about potential changes to their funding, and particularly with high needs disapplications, talk to us in the ESFA at an early stage before submitting an application request so that we can advise on what, if anything, is actually required. So now just moving on to general disapplication requests. On the current slide, we can see the most common types of general disapplication requests received. I don't intend to read out the bullet point list in its entirety, but as you can see from the slide, it gives you a general sense of which requests come into the department most frequently. Now, as can be seen on this next slide, exceptional circumstances were the most common disapplication we request in 24-25. Now, work has been undertaken ahead of 25-26 in respect to local authorities using the exceptional circumstances factor. We've engaged with local authorities who use the factor to ensure that applications are in line with the criteria or where this application is due for renewal. As we move towards a national funding formula, we would expect to see fewer disapplications of this type, and so to support applications, we require stronger evidence of exceptional costs and why these may be unavoidable. And we would just like to take this opportunity to advise that there are certain requests that we would not support, and these would relate to capital expenditure, swimming pools, connected party transactions, or operational costs which all schools are expected to meet, such as utilities, maintenance, and cleaning. Now, on the current slide, we can see the most crucial detail that we require to support disapplication requests for exceptional premises funding. It's crucial that any summary references the paragraph and page number from the in-date lease, joint use service level agreement, and giving the details listed on the slide itself. Again, I won't read out those bulleted details, but that's an indication of the kind of information that will be needed. Okay, so now just moving on to early years disapplications, starting first of all with the sort of supporting evidence we would look for with any disapplication of this nature. We do like to see that local authorities have displayed a consideration of alternatives, not just the preferred approach they want to take. We'd like to see a description of why the stated option they're pursuing is the preferred choice, and a clear consideration of the impact of any alternatives that they've also considered as well. We'd like to see calculation modelling to show exactly how the request affects relevant parties in monetary terms, depending on whether it's a pass-through adjustment or reducing central spend. And it's also helpful for us to understand the wider implications for request. So for the local authorities to therefore demonstrate why, if hypothetically the ESFA was to decline a request, how that would affect early years provision within the local authorities area. In terms of considerations, again, echoing some of Karamia's comments from earlier in the presentation, we would again stress the importance of a decision from schools forum as early as possible. It's also helpful for us within the department to have early signposting on if a disapplication is coming our way. So if you are in a position where you can confirm that a disapplication is going to be pursued, if you can let us know that in advance, that's really helpful, even if you're not in a position at that point to actually submit the relevant pro forma to ourselves. Having that early foresight that it is coming down the track is very helpful for us if that can be possible. In terms of the overview of our process, we obviously have a digital disapplication pro forma that we use now, and that's still very much in place for this year as well. So once that pro forma is submitted to us, we will obviously receive it and aim to process it as quickly as we can, liaising with you directly if there's any further information we require in order to speed up the decision for you ultimately. Now, on the next slide, again, staying with early years, it just sets out that the most common request for early years disapplications does relate to the early years pass-through. Now, it is important to note that the recent changes published in the 24-25 early years operational guidance have have in particular highlighted the criteria in which a disapplication for the pass-through rate will be considered. So just to quickly cover off what that criteria is now as set out in the operational guide. Firstly, A, the criteria will be that a disapplication is essential to avoid a significant overall reduction in the level of specialist earlier send services offered to providers free or on a subsidised basis. And the evidence for this should include a description and costing of current services, an assessment of how these might need to be constrained with a local authority to comply with the 95% pass-through requirement and the impact this may have, why it's not possible for local authorities to offer such services on a buyback model, or B, the criteria that would be that the disapplication is essential for the local authority to meet its statutory early years duties, for example, delivering the entitlement for disadvantaged 2-year-olds, and the evidence for that would be a description and costing of meeting the statutory duties in question, an assessment of how these duties might need to be constrained with a local authority to comply with the 95% pass-through requirement and the impact this might have, an explanation of why it's not possible to implement a more efficient operating model. Now, for all disapplications, local authorities will be expected to present a strong evidence that if the disapplication were to be allowed, the delivery of childcare entitlements would not be jeopardised, and such evidence would need to include the pass-through percentage the local authority has applied for and the calculation to show its derivation, and the impact of the proposed lower pass-through threshold and the average funding rate paid to providers in 25-26. Now, evidence the providers will be willing to deliver enough places to meet demand for early years entitlement from which the pass-through rate would be disapplied in 25-26 the proposed new funding rate as well. Now, again, as Karamia signposted earlier on in the presentation, we do require an equalities impact assessment with all disapplication requests that we do receive. The DFE is a Department of Opportunity, and all disapplication requests do require this assessment as part of its supporting information. Equality impact assessments are provided to demonstrate that a local authority is complying with the public sector equality duty as set out in Section 149 of the Equality Act 2010. Now, the guiding principle is that the sufficient information is provided which demonstrates that a local authority has given due regard for the need to eliminate discrimination and harassment and victimisation, advance equality of opportunity between persons who share a relevant protected characteristic and the person who does not share it, foster good relations between persons who share a protected characteristic and persons who do not. We are content with the overarching principle that children and young people with similar levels of need will receive similar levels of funding. However, the equalities impact assessment should also give consideration to all protected characteristics, irrespective of whether these are relevant to the request. Consideration should be given to how your proposals eliminate discrimination, harassment or victimisation of any persons with a protected characteristic, and proposals should also advance equality of opportunity between persons who share a relevant protected characteristic and those who do not share it. So a final few key messages for all of you to quickly cover off. So firstly, we would stress to all of you to try and take an objective view with any disapplication request you are submitting. When you've got your business case ready, take a step back from it and consider any questions you would ask yourself if you were the person assessing it, as well as what you think your decision would be on that request, again, if you were someone independently assessing it. And the supporting information that you provide with your request should always address the exam question of why should the Secretary of State agree to this request as a departure from the usual funding arrangements. And again, we've stressed it a few times in the session, but again, if there's any queries or questions that we can support with, please do get in contact with us through our mailbox addresses, which we'll share at the end of the presentation again. We've got some useful links which will be included in the slide notes when they're circulated, which just highlight the various operational guides and material that's on gov.uk. I would presume most of you are fairly familiar with these documents already, but if you need to access them quickly, there's a listing here at the end of the presentation that should just allow you to access them as quickly as you need to. And finally, the contact us information on this slide in front of you here just gives the mailbox addresses for how you can reach us. So for any queries regarding any specific disapplications you have, you can reach us at the LA Disapplications mailbox. And again, please do use that mailbox if you want to give us any forewarning that you're intending to send a disapplication at some point in the near future. And then for those local authorities that do have self-devalve agreements, we have a separate mailbox that you can use for any queries that you have as well.